Good day. The previous day, yesterday, was a relatively quiet day in terms of Russian missile strikes over Ukraine. And I think this gave an impression that perhaps the Russian missile offensive against Ukraine and against Ukraine's energy infrastructure was starting to abate. After all, President Putin, some days ago, said that during his press conference in Astana, said that he didn't see the need for massive missile strikes against Ukraine at this particular time. Well, that was yesterday. Today it's different. Today we see missile strikes from Russia resume with a vengeance, and there have been attacks across the whole of Ukraine. And by the way, and for the record, today most of the strikes are being carried out by cruise missiles, by the various jet-powered cruise missiles that Russia has, large missiles, not by the Uranium-2 kamikaze drones or loitering munitions, if you prefer, which we've seen used on other days. I suspect that this is, again, going back to what John Helmer said a couple of weeks ago now, that this is not so much a game that the Russians are playing with Ukraine, it's just a reflection of their tactics and their strategy. They do aim to seriously degrade Ukraine's energy system. To some extent, they're doing it incrementally with these missile attacks, but ultimately, they're striking at the various elements of the system with the view of establishing how it works, how it's repaired when individual items become damaged, and then, of course, they're able to recalibrate their missile strikes in order to inflict more damage even as the repairs are being attempted or are being carried out. And ultimately, and to some extent, Putin's words appeared to imply this when he said that he didn't see any need for massive missile strikes against Ukraine at the moment. Coming back to Helmer's view, I think that does speak of an eventual much bigger missile strikes eventually when the moment is right, presumably when the Russians launch their offensive, their big winter offensive, which there's every indication, at least that I can see, that that is coming. So many more strikes today, many more blackouts in Ukraine today. Again, let me repeat a point that I'd made, I think, 1 or 2 videos ago, and which has been made now by many people. The original infrastructure, energy infrastructure created in Ukraine by the Soviet Union all those decades ago, already contained within it a very large degree of redundancy. It was designed to be able to cope with situations where there were shortages, parts of the system were not functioning. So there was already a large excess of capacity within the system when it was first created. And that capacity has steadily grown as Ukraine's economy over the last year has declined together with its energy use. So that I've seen some suggestions that Ukraine is producing something like 50, or was before these missile strikes began, producing something like, or had a capacity to produce something like 50% more electricity than it really needed. And this, by the way, no doubt explains why Ukraine had become a significant exporter of electricity to countries like Poland and Moldova, even though it's now had to reduce those, or in fact bring those exports to a stop, as it now has to deal with these Russian missile strikes and the damage done to its infrastructure system. But anyway, the key point is that the damage that's been done up to now is not critical to Ukraine in terms of providing electricity, though Ukraine is having to carry out rebalances of the system. It's having to move electricity around, something which may become increasingly difficult, by the way, as the Russians start targeting or increasingly target the various interconnections within the system. There isn't, as of yet, a general shortage of electricity within Ukraine. But of course, with every day that this missile offensive continues, with winter closing in and electricity use presumably increasing in Ukraine, the system will start to feel the pressure, will begin to buckle, and at some point, any system which is subjected to these kind of attacks will eventually break down. Now, whilst I'm on the topic of the Russian missile attacks on the Ukrainian missile system, I should say something further, which is that one consequence of these missile attacks is that Ukraine is having to use its air defense system in order to try, to the extent that it can, to parry these missile attacks. And apparently, those who follow these things are starting to notice that the Ukrainian air defense system, as well as looking increasingly disorganized and ineffective, but it's also starting to do perhaps some rather strange things. It appears, for example, to be launching fewer surface-to-air missiles. And that's led to some theories that Ukraine may be running out of surface-to-air missiles, specifically S-300 surface-to-air missiles, which form the basis of the Ukrainian air defense system. And that possibly one of the purposes of this Russian missile offensive is precisely to deplete Ukraine's air defenses in preparation for the major air offensive that Russia is presumably planning to accompany its ground offensive in midwinter. Well, that's possible, but of course one's also got to bear in mind the possibility that Ukraine might be intentionally holding back some of its surface-to-air missiles, also in preparation for the possibility that the Russians are planning some kind of air offensive in the future. In the meantime, Ukraine has apparently been trying to shoot down missiles using the increasingly few numbers of fighter jets that it has left. It's actually deploying fighter jets, and they're trying to chase Russian cruise missiles and shoot them down with air-to-air missiles. And by the way, there's some reports that at least some of these fighter jets that Ukraine is using are MiG-29 fighter jets, which were sent to Ukraine by Azerbaijan before the war started for repair and refurbishment, and that Ukraine has simply appropriated them and brought them into its air force. That's possible. I'm no way of confirming that one way or the other. And of course, it's not inconceivable that Azerbaijan, for its part, has quietly agreed to this. I mean, I don't know. But regardless, using fighter jets to shoot down air-to-air these cruise missiles, and of course, even more so, using fighter jets to shoot down these Uranium-2 kamikaze drones, or loitering munitions, if you like, is not a cost-effective use of fighter jets. And I would add that it does make those fighter jets vulnerable to Russian interception. And given that the Russians presumably know the path of their own cruise missiles, and given that the Russians are known to have a significant air detection capability, they've got their equivalent of the AWACS system, the A-50 mainstay aircraft, apparently flying regular patrols over Ukraine, keeping track of what goes on in Ukrainian airspace. It must be said Ukrainian airspace is enormous, as is the country. So it's probably not possible to track every part of it. But as I said, the Russians know where their missiles are going, so they can presumably have some idea where any Ukrainian fighter jets might be that are trying to intercept those missiles. And that might make it easier to track those fighter jets. Anyway, when those fighter jets are there trying to intercept those missiles, they become vulnerable themselves to long-range interception by the Russians. And the Russians have means to do that. They have some very long-range surface-to-air missiles. And apparently, a couple of days ago, a Ukrainian fighter jet was shot down by a Russian surface-to-air missile, launched some traveling some 300 kilometers before it finally reached and hit this Ukrainian fighter jet, and that's apparently a record. The previous record, which is, I believe, 220 kilometers, was also reached by another surface-to-air missile shooting down another Ukrainian fighter jet earlier in the war. But anyway, that earlier record, has now been exceeded. But on top of that, Russia has deployed MiG-31 interceptor aircraft in Belarus. These can be used, apparently, to launch Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, which are intended to destroy targets on the ground, but they can also operate the R-33 and R-37 very long-range air-to-air missiles, and these MiG-31 fighter jets have apparently enormously powerful radars, and of course they would presumably be operating anyway in conjunction with those other radar systems and detection devices like the A-50 mainstay that the Russians have, which I spoke about previously. And anyway, the Russians probably do have the capabilities to shoot down Ukrainian MiG-29s that are chasing these cruise missiles, and for all I know, that's what they're doing. And there's been reports that Ukrainian fighter jets are shot down at fairly regular intervals, and it may be that that's also a part of this missile offensive, that the missile offensive, as well as targeting the energy system, is also depleting Ukraine's air defense system, or seeking to do so, and is also setting up what's left of Ukraine's air force for systematic shoot down, again clearing the way for this major Russian air offensive which may be coming. And remember, just to remind people, General Surovikin, who is now the overall Russian commander of all the forces, ground forces and all other forces in Ukraine, including, I suspect, the naval forces, by the way. He is the person who is in charge of the joint forces, and that means ground, air, and sea. Surovikin has previously commanded the Russian aerospace forces, so he presumably has experience and knowledge of how to use air forces and how to weaken the air defenses of an adversary. Anyway, regardless, Russian missile offensive back on with a vengeance this morning. More and more missile strikes, even as I'm making this program. Lots of reports from all kinds of sources as to the exact targets that have been struck and which have been destroyed, and no doubt that's going to continue over the course of the day, and we could probably see more of that tomorrow. Anyway, all of this is happening alongside this drumbeat of rumors and allegations from both sides about who supposedly is trying to destroy the Novaya Kakhovka dam. This dam in Kherson region, which crisscrosses the Dnieper River, and which the Russians claim Ukraine is trying to blow up the locks, releasing vast amounts of water, which will flood the plains of Kherson region, and that this is one of the primary reasons why civilians are having to be evacuated from those places. And so that's one view, the Russian view. The Ukrainians, and very interestingly, parts of the Western media, are saying that it's the Russians, on the contrary, who are intending to blow up this dam. I've seen the Institute for the Study of War in Washington repeat that allegation, that this is probably the Russian intention, and that they're trying to prepare, these Russian claims that it's Ukraine that's trying to destroy the dam, that this is supposedly a false flag idea that the Russians have, that it's they themselves who are trying to destroy the dam, but rather than admit that, they're trying to blame Ukraine for it. And this has come along with all sorts of claims from various sides about how the dam is supposed to be destroyed. I've read yet another article or small piece in Russian media that Ukraine is now trying to send underwater drones to destroy the dam, to destroy the locks on the dam. So that's from the Russian side, and also very contradictory stories from various Ukrainian sources about why the Russians would want to destroy this dam. It's been suggested that flooding the countryside in that kind of way would impede the advance of Ukrainian troops towards Kherson city. In other words, it would strengthen the defenses along Kherson city. A person, a regular correspondent, whom writes to me, who emails me, and who I believe has served in the Indian military, and who, by the way, is sympathetic to the Russians, also thinks that Russia blowing up this dam might indeed be a plan that the Russians actually have. But he suggests a rather different interpretation to these events. He suggests that the Russians do have a plan to pull back to the east bank of the Dnieper River, abandoning Kherson city and the whole of the west bank of the Dnieper River, in other words, terminating their bridgehead there, and that the destruction of the dam is intended to flood this region, essentially bogging down and trapping whatever Ukrainian troops, large numbers of Ukrainian troops, which would be moving south towards Kherson, making them incredibly vulnerable to Russian missile and air attack, and at the same time making it impossible for Ukraine to redeploy these forces north to repel the big Russian offensive which is to come. Well, for all I know, that is the Russian plan. I mean, that I have no way of knowing one way or the other. As I've said many times, the Russian military, and indeed the Ukrainian military, do not share their plans with me. I'm going to venture, however, a few guesses here. I am skeptical about theories that the Russians really do intend to destroy this dam. And I have to say, I'm a little bit surprised that, well, maybe not surprised. I would say that I'm intrigued by the fact that Western sources, Western media outlets, which tend to poo-poo suggestions of false flags when they've been alleged before, especially in the Middle East, now have embraced this theory of a Russian false flag so enthusiastically. Can I say, I find this idea that the Russians themselves are planning to destroy this dam very difficult to understand. First of all, I've seen reports from Russian officials in this area that the damage that would be done, the amount of flooding that would be done if the dam were destroyed, that it is somewhat exaggerated, that this idea that this entire landscape would become swept with water, flooded with water, is not really true, which argues against any theory that flooding the landscape would impede the Ukrainian forces significantly as they advance towards Kherson, or would cause them to get bogged down. What it might do is do significant damage to the many pontoon bridges and crossings that the Russians have apparently established across the Dnieper, and which they're using to resupply their forces on the west bank of the Dnieper. In other words, their forces who are defending Kherson region. After all, that's what the Russians themselves did some weeks ago. They launched missile strikes on a dam in the area of Kryvyi Rog, city in this area of Ukraine. That dam burst and caused a rush of water down the Ingulets River, and some of the pontoon bridges that Ukraine had built were swept away. And this did briefly affect Ukrainian military operations in that part of Ukraine against Kherson region. But I would say that the water levels quickly reduced. Ukraine was able to repair its pontoon bridges and create new pontoon bridges, so that the respite was temporary. But presumably, these Russian pontoon bridges across the Dnieper are on a much bigger scale, and if there is indeed a rush of water, a column of water sweeping down the Dnieper, sweeping away these pontoon bridges, that might be more of a problem to repair these pontoon bridges quickly, especially if Ukraine is indeed launching or thinking of launching an offensive against Kherson city, as everybody appears to think they are. So that seems to me to make more sense of what is going on. In other words, that it is indeed Ukraine that's trying to cause damage, to breach the dam, and it's perhaps using missiles, not very effectively, by the way, but also perhaps underwater drones, in order to disrupt Russian communications to the west bank of the Dnieper. And that seems to me to make much more sense of what we're seeing. So for all those reasons, I have to say I am personally inclined to discount this theory of a Russian false flag. I've not really seen any evidence at all that is on the Russians' agenda in any conceivable way. it seems to me much more plausible that this is the Ukrainian strategy, that it's the Ukrainians that are trying to cause damage to the dam, and that their objective is to damage these Russian pontoon bridges and ferry crossings and all of that. Now that leads me to a report which I saw on a Russian news site called Rydovka. I believe Rydovka, as well as being a website, is also an actual newspaper that can be read in Russia. Though I can't say that for certain, but it does cover an awful lot of Russian news in, I should say, a somewhat tabloidy way. But having said that, on the discussions of the war, Rydovka does have quite a few reporters in Ukraine covering the war. And overall, if you take into account their obvious bias, what they report tends to be pretty reliable. One of the things I would say is that they do, for example, report Russian retreats, Russian defeats. They may try and put a positive spin on them, but I've never seen them actively suppress bad news. And as I said, I've tended to find their reports from a factual point of view, reliable. Now, I say all of this because this report purports to quote something which a Ukrainian official or ex-official, Vladislav Seleznev, who is said to have been a former spokesman of the Ukrainian General Staff, apparently said on Ukrainian television. Now, I haven't seen the original television report, and I haven't seen much confirmation of this from Ukrainian sources, but this report, as Rydovka reproduces it, it does seem to be relatively accurate. It does give me the impression of being accurate, an accurate reproduction of what Seleznev said in this program on Ukrainian television. Anyway, what Seleznev says is that the Russians have significantly strengthened the grouping of their troops in Kherson region. And he's quoted as saying that we know that fierce local battles are now taking place on the lower bank of the Dnieper River in its lower reaches. There is no advancement of the Ukrainian defense forces as part of the counteroffensive. And Rydovka says that Seleznev has admitted that for the moment, Ukraine cannot conduct a successful offensive in this area. Now, I think we have to take that with a particular pinch of salt, because it could be that this is an overinterpretation of Seleznev's words, that Seleznev is saying that for the moment, Ukraine isn't able to make any breakthroughs because the Russian forces in Kherson region have been substantially reinforced. Maybe he's not saying that it is impossible ever to conduct a successful Ukrainian offensive in Kherson region. But then apparently he went on to say that there's now 30,000 Russian troops in this area. Not quite sure whether all of those troops are west of the Dnieper River, but as I read the Rydovka report, that seemed to be the implication. And then Seleznev said that the fights are actually extremely tough, and he went on to say that the Russians have sorted out their logistics problems, that they now are fully equipped, these forces are fully equipped, they have no shortages of fuel or ammunition, and that the Russians have created various pontoon bridge crossings and other infrastructure which is enabling them to keep their troops west of the Dnieper, perhaps 30,000 troops fully supplied. By the way, whilst I'm on this topic, there was an article in The Guardian which tried to suggest that in fact the Ukrainians are making advances in Kherson region. I read it. I read this article, but in fact, my impression on the contrary from the bits that I read from this article is that Ukrainian forces are actually at a standstill. It reported Ukrainian troops as saying that they've received reports that some Russian units in Kherson region are at the end of their tether and are about to break. But the particular unit that these Guardian journalists were reporting from, the soldiers of that particular unit admitted that that wasn't at all the case with the Russians whom they themselves were fighting. So Kakhovka says that the Russians have reinforced west of the Dnieper, and as I've discussed in several previous videos, that is also the impression I am getting, that a few weeks ago Russian forces west of the Dnieper were stretched rather thin, mainly light forces, paratroopers, airborne infantry, who by definition are extremely tough, well-trained, skilled, highly motivated soldiers, but who lack tanks and heavy armored vehicles and mobile guns and that kind of thing. But that kind of armored infantry and tanks that they are now actually have now actually been deployed west of the Dnieper, and that they are operating there. So, and that of course is consistent with what the Russian command, Surovikin and co, have been saying, that Russian defenses have been hardening right across the battle lines, and that reserves are being created. And of course it's consistent with what we're hearing happening with the mobilization, that the troops who have been called up as part of this mobilization, the ones who were recently in the military within the last few months, but who left the military, but who have now been called up again, that they've been reintegrated with their old units. Their old units are now strengthening. They're now able to hold the line more effectively because there are more of them. And as I said, Seleznev is reported here as saying that the Russians have established all of these pontoon bridges and other means of resupplying their troops west of the Dnieper River. And that seems to me to create a logical reason why the Ukrainians would want to destroy these pontoon bridges and destroy the dam in order to sweep away these pontoon bridges across that the Russians have established across the Dnieper River. It's quite simply, if the Russian forces west of the Dnieper are reinforcing, if they're increasing their numbers, if their supply lines are now stable with all this traffic that's passing across these pontoon bridges and other bridges and whatever other systems the Russians have established along the Dnieper, then it's perhaps not surprising that the Ukrainians are looking for some means to disrupt these supplies if they're going to launch a successful offensive. And that would explain, presumably, why they're trying to destroy the dam, trying to create a column of water that would sweep along the Dnieper River to submerge these pontoon bridges, marooning the Russian force, at least for a time, on the west bank of the Dnieper, until the Russians were able to repair these pontoon bridges, by which time, however, the Ukrainians might or perhaps would have made further inroads into the Russian defences west of the Dnieper River, and perhaps, just possibly, even captured Kherson city itself. So that, it seems to me, ties everything up, provides a coherent explanation of what's going on and why these attacks on the Novaya Kakhovka dam are taking place, and why the Russians are concerned about it, and why, in case there's a problem, they've evacuated civilians from the area. Now, I would say this, however, I mean, the Dnieper is a very wide river, and having said that, it is only a river. Presumably there are abilities to create detection devices to see whether there are, in fact, any underwater drones or floating mines trying to reach the dam and to try to intercept those underwater drones and floating mines. There are all kinds of stories from the Second World War. I don't know how relevant they still are, that you can create nets and things that interfere with the movement of these kind of drones, mines. And I've also heard stories about how you can use frogmen to do the same thing. I'm not obviously an expert, but the dam, if it's going to be attacked from underwater, is hardly, I would have thought, an easy target, because presumably you can create defenses. I may be wrong here. I may have got this entirely wrong. But anyway, that's how it seems to me. Now, of course, Ukraine is continuing to launch lots of HIMARS missiles at the dam, to a certain extent still on the Antonovsky Bridge. I've discussed this many times. I've said how difficult it is, given the enormous engineering strength of dams and bridges, for the kind of missiles that the HIMARS is able to launch, to really, how difficult it is for those kind of missiles to really do damage to these kind of structures. And by the way, targeting locks with long-range missiles can't be an entirely easy thing either, but perhaps it can be done. But perhaps more to the point, it's also becoming increasingly clear that, in contrast to the problems that Ukrainian air defense seems to be having increasingly in shooting down Russian missiles and drones, Russian air defense is becoming increasingly successful in shooting down HIMARS missiles. I read, for example, that one Ukrainian HIMARS missile strike, apparently on this area in Ukraine, involved a barrage of 12 HIMARS missiles. The Russian air defense was able, or so the Russians claim, to shoot down 11 of these missiles. Now, obviously that's a Russian claim, but I've been getting the sense for some time that these Russian claims, that the HIMARS has been steadily losing effectiveness since it was first deployed, that this is true, that the Russians are indeed becoming more successful in shooting down these HIMARS missiles as their air defense gains a better understanding of how the HIMARS system works. And I would add that all of the reports that I'm seeing also confirm that the system, the air defense system that is being used by the Russians to shoot down these missiles, is a specially adapted version of the well-known Pantsir point defense combined cannon and missile system, which the Russians have been developing for many years and deployed in many theaters, including, by the way, in Syria and which in Syria has, by the way, proved very successful in shooting down kamikaze drones, swarms of kamikaze drones. The Panzer, up to now, is a unique system. As far as I can see, no other military anywhere in the world has anything analogous. So perhaps Ukraine will manage, I presume it is Ukraine, will manage to destroy the Novaya Kakhovka dam, creating massive problems for the Russians. But I wouldn't say at the moment that that looks to me a foregone conclusion. We shall see. Anyway, that's the military situation. Front lines everywhere apparently stable. Constant fighting in Bakhmut and around it. Supposed reports, numerous reports, that the Russians have now been making more headway in Soledar. This is this northern suburb of Bakhmut, where the Ukraine has also been defending fiercely. Battle of Bakhmut, in other words, is continuing a lot in the same incremental way that it has been doing for some time. But in all other respects, the battle lines for the moment are stable. Perhaps there will be a big last Ukrainian push in Kherson next week, the week that's coming. If so, obviously I'll have to cover it. But for the moment, battle lines are stable. And of course, with every day that passes, more Russian troops join the forces in Ukraine from the mobilization that's still underway. Apparently now 260,000 reservists have been called up. When Putin spoke in Astana a short time ago, it was 220,000, but the number has now increased to 260,000. The numbers are growing all the time, and more of these troops are being trained, and more of them are being inducted into the Russian military, and we see more Russian military deployments taking place in all sorts of places. And of course, the weather continues to deteriorate, making Ukrainian offensive operations more difficult, and that cut-off date, the 8th of November, the day of the midterm elections, looms ever closer, slowly closing, or rather rapidly closing, Ukraine's time window, to at least the time window Ukraine has been apparently given by its Western allies to achieve some sort of big victory in the war. Anyway, that's the situation in Ukraine at the moment, or at least in the war at the moment. Now, there's been lots of things going on in other places. In China, in Beijing, the Communist Party of China continues to hold its Congress, which everybody anticipates is going to end with the re-election of President Xi Jinping to a third term as the Communist Party of China's General Secretary, paving the way for his confirmation, presumably as Chinese president for a third term fairly soon. Now, there's been lots of coverage of this Congress in the Western media. I ignore much of it. I do want to comment on one particular incident that has taken place over the last few hours. The previous Xi Jinping's immediate predecessor, Hu Jintao, predecessor as president and general secretary, had to leave the Congress. There have been pictures, film circulating all over the place of him being helped I'm using the word helped carefully, out of the hall by various Chinese officials, with Xi Jinping and other senior members of the Chinese leadership looking on with looks of concern. Now, there's been an enormous amount of coverage of this in the West and elsewhere. Speculations that this incident reflects tensions within the Chinese leadership, possibly tensions between Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping, opposition to Xi Jinping's re-election. I've seen the film in its entirety, and I'm going to give my own take on it and make it clear that I don't agree with any analysis that looks at this in those sort of terms. Now, Hu Jintao was on the dais, sitting just left of Xi Jinping himself. In other words, the two were sitting next to each other. There'd been a serious quarrel, and Hu Jintao was in some kind of disfavor. I can't imagine that prior to the convening of this meeting, he'd have been positioned next to Xi Jinping in that kind of way. I say that because these party congresses are presumably very carefully planned affairs, and as was also the case, by the way, in the Soviet Union, seating arrangements are very carefully prepared in advance. So if there'd been real tensions between Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao, I can't imagine that they would have been placed sitting next to each other in that kind of way. By the way, the very fact that Hu Jintao was sitting next to Xi Jinping, in my opinion, reflects Hu Jintao's continued very high status within the Chinese leadership, and is intended to convey the fact that the leadership is united. Now, if you actually look at the picture of Hu Jintao's, I mean, it seems to me that it's clear that who is now 79 years old, he doesn't look very well. He looks frail, and I suspect that he was quite ill, and perhaps it's flu, perhaps it's COVID. Who knows? I'm not able to say what he was ill with, but he does look unwell. And it didn't seem to me that he was being escorted from the room by security officials, manhandled out of the hall by security officials, as some people are saying. The people who were helping him out were helping him out, and the looks of all the officials around, including Xi Jinping's, looked concerned. So I suspect what happened is an oldish man, not feeling very well, helped out of the room by various other, no doubt at the instigation of other Chinese officials, as he was clearly unwell and unable to keep going, and that is all that there is to this story. That's my own interpretation of it. I'm not going to say anything more. I don't pretend to be a China expert. We're starting on the Duran to assemble a group of people who are, and maybe as the Congress ends, we'll be able to revisit this particular incident. Now, other things going on in all sorts of places. There's still, to my mind, enormous mystery about what the British Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, did, or why he went to Washington in that very strange way. Some people in Russia are seizing on the fact that Wallace appears to have given, in a speech he gave to Parliament, a statement he gave to Parliament, a rather moderate account of this rather odd incident when a Russian fighter jet came close to a British surveillance aircraft, over the Black Sea. A missile was launched from this fighter jet. It doesn't seem to have been directed at this British surveillance aircraft. Wallace, however, felt concerned about this, wrote to the Russian Defense Secretary Sergei Shoigu asking for an explanation. Shoigu wrote back saying that this was all down to a technical malfunction, and Wallace accepted the Russian explanation, which is undoubtedly the correct one. And some people are seeing this as some kind of sign of moderation on Wallace's part, of some kind of desire by the British military to de-escalate the situation over Ukraine. All I can say about that is that they should read, in that case, the entirety of the statement that Wallace gave to Parliament, which was mainly about British support for Ukraine. And I have to say, I didn't get much sign of any slackening of support or moderation from the British side coming out from the totality of this statement. That was not my impression at all. Having said that, if you do want to believe that there was some signs that the British are, or at least the British military are perhaps trying to de-escalate in some way, if you want to read Wallace's statement in that kind of way, then it is interesting that the US Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, had what appears to have been a polite call with the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, one of very few calls that happen nowadays, in which Austin spoke of the need to maintain contact with Shoigu apparently agreeing. And it could be, it might be, that this call between Austin and Shoigu is connected in some way with Wallace's sudden dash to Washington. I don't know, and I don't think anybody does at the moment. And as I said, there have been all kinds of theories and ideas about what has caused this visit by Wallace to Washington. Some very interesting ideas conveyed to me in private emails, some from some fairly well informed and level-headed people. I think that we know so little about this whole affair that it's perhaps unwise to speculate too far. I've suggested in the past that it might be connected in some form to the political crisis here in Britain. But all I will say is that with Wallace perhaps rushing to Washington so as to head off any attempt to try to enlist him in the Conservative Party leadership election. That's a theory I've floated. But the truth is we simply don't know. And perhaps, given how little we know about this incident and how difficult it is to make sense of it, perhaps we shouldn't speculate too much about it. It is all very strange, however. And no doubt at some point, perhaps many years from now, we'll get a better sense of the truth. In the meantime, we've had a summit happen with the EU in which there was an argument about gas, with several countries insisting on a price cap for gas. The industry, the gas industry, is extremely critical of this idea. They think it's a half-baked idea, which is more likely to lead to shortages and problems. The German government, Olaf Scholz, initially said that it is a bad idea, they wouldn't support it. And then, as Olaf Scholz invariably does, he came round and did support it in the end, and we now have serious proposals for this price cap idea on gas to be pushed forward at some point over the next few weeks. And we also hear that the US government is apparently now suggesting that the price that the G7 is going to try and enforce on globally traded Russian oil, that's fixed at $60 a barrel. Current price of oil is around $80 to $90 a barrel. Now, I've made it very clear my, shall we say, skepticism, my belief that these price cap ideas are extremely bad. Note that in every case, the industry, the people who understand how markets work, advise against them, and note how on every occasion the political leaders ignore what the industry is saying and just forge ahead. Now, of course, the industry is self-interested. They want to charge whatever price they can for the product that they're selling. But I have to say that if you take simple economics, and economics from whichever school of economics that you adhere to, it does seem to me that this is a direct interference in the operation of the price mechanism, disrupting the sale of something, be it gas or oil, which is now in increasingly short supply. And given that the price mechanism is the means you use to regulate consumption, these price caps make absolutely no sense at all at this particular time. The only thing they're doing in the meantime, until they come into operation, is that they are infuriating the producers. Now, we've already seen how angry the oil producers, the OPEC Plus cartel, has been with the oil price cap idea. It's one of the factors which has undoubtedly provoked the Saudis to support the 2 million a barrel day reduction in oil production, which has so upset the United States. But this gas price cap idea is guaranteed also to infuriate the other gas producers. And we've already heard that Qatar is no longer going to supply gas to Europe this winter, and apparently Nigeria is now saying it's going to do the same. And it's not surprising, because producers do not want consumer countries dictating the price of the commodity that those producers supply. Again, it's not difficult to understand this. So this seems to me another idea that is guaranteed to create further supply shortages. Perhaps not immediately, but over time. But there it is. That's the route that, unsurprisingly, European and G7 leaders are taking. The idea of actually looking for a de-escalation of the entire crisis, a serious attempt to try and find some way to get supply moving again. That, of course, is not on the agenda, because that would involve admissions of failure, of strategic defeat, as they would say, which these leaders don't want to entertain. So we're going down the rabbit hole of these price cap ideas, all of which trigger brief moments of euphoria, and then I suspect are going to create all kinds of further problems further down the line. Anyway, that's where we are at the moment. That's where the situation is today. We'll see whether more things develop over the next few hours and days. I've now almost reached an hour in this video. I'm giving myself a rule that I don't go beyond an hour in these videos. Besides, I've really discussed all the things that I wanted to discuss today. So that's me for the day. And just to remind you again, you can find us on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, and of course also Rofkin. You can go to our shop, buy the amazing things that you will find there: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all of those things. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And of course, also, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon, and have a very good day until then.